On June 2004, Jeff Bezos sent an email to his senior leadership team at Amazon. The email was short. Its consequences were permanent. Effective immediately, PowerPoint presentations were banned from executive meetings. The replacement would be 6-page narrative memos, written in complete sentences and complete paragraphs, to be read in silence, independently, by every attendee at the beginning of every meeting for 20 to 30 minutes before anyone spoke. Bezos had been thinking about this for months. He and his chief of staff, Colin Breyer, had read an essay on a business flight by Edward Tufte, a Yale professor of information design, titled The Cognitive Style of PowerPoint, Pitching Out Corrupts Within. Tufte's argument was precise. Bullet points let the presenter hide logical gaps behind catchy phrases and visual formatting. The audience cannot challenge an argument they cannot see. Slide decks flatten the relative importance of ideas and obscure the connections between them. Bezos' reasoning from the email itself was, the narrative structure of a good memo forces better thought and better understanding of what's more important than what. PowerPoint-style presentations somehow give permission to gloss over ideas, flatten out any sense of relative importance, and ignore the interconnectedness of ideas. A great 6-page memo, Bezos later wrote in his 2018 shareholder letter, takes a week or more to produce. It goes through multiple drafts, it's shared with colleagues, set aside, revised with a fresh mind. The process is deliberately time-consuming for the writer. Bezos himself reportedly reads each memo, assuming every sentence is wrong until he can prove otherwise. This sounds like a formatting preference. It's actually a structural intervention. Every failure mode documented in this series shares a common element: information that existed but could not reach the decision maker in a form that compelled challenge. Bullet points obscure, narrative exposes. The 6-page memo was designed to make the reasoning visible so the reasoning could then be attacked. This is the 10th Man Podcast. Welcome back to the 10th Man Podcast. I'm Chris Porden. 6 episodes in, the pattern has been consistent. A system fails because the consensus suppresses the challenge, and afterward, someone builds a mechanism to prevent it from happening again. This episode moves to the boardroom. The question becomes, can dissent be built into a corporation? Can it be encoded into the processes and principles of how decisions get made so that it functions at scale across thousands of people, regardless of who's in the room? 2 companies attempted this. Amazon, a technology company that grew to over 1.5 million employees, tried to encode dissent into written processes and formal leadership principles that function regardless of who is present. Berkshire Hathaway, the investment conglomerate, concentrated the dissent function in one person, Charlie Munger, Warren Buffett's partner for 50 years, whose explicit structural role was to reject the investment thesis before it could be approved. Both models address the same failure modes this show has documented. They arrive at opposite architectures. That difference is the subject of this episode. Amazon's approach to institutionalizing dissent rests on 3 interlocking mechanisms. Each one was built to solve a specific decision-making failure, and each one maps to a failure mode documented in the previous 6 episodes. The first is the 6-page memo. Before 2004, Amazon ran its executive meetings the same way most large companies did, with PowerPoint. The S-Team meeting, held every Tuesday for 4 hours, was the most important recurring meeting in the company. Roughly 80% of the time was spent reviewing progress on strategic goals. Each review began with a slide deck presented by the responsible team. The stakes were high. The format was weak. The problem with slides, as Bezos came to understand, is structural. A slide deck is a performance. The presenter controls the pacing, the emphasis, the framing. The audience is receiving information at the presenter's speed, in the presenter's sequence, with the presenter's editorial decisions about what matters and what doesn't. The audience can't go back and reread a claim. They can't cross-reference page 3 with page 5. They can't interrogate the logical chain that connects the recommendation to the evidence because the chain is distributed across 40 slides and has been flattened into bullet points. A 6-page memo inverts this. The audience reads at their own pace. They can compare section 1 with section 4. They can find the gap between the stated assumption and the supporting evidence. They can write questions in the margin. By the time the silence ends and the discussion begins, every person in the room has the same depth of understanding, and every weakness in the argument is visible. Colin Breyer, Bezos' former chief of staff, and Bill Carr, a former Amazon vice president, wrote in their book, Working Backwards, that the narrative format conveys roughly 10 times as much information as a slide deck of comparable length. The pixel density of prose, as they put it, is 7 to 9 times the pixel density of a slide. Information density is a structural feature. It determines how much of the reasoning is available for challenge. The second mechanism is the PRFAQ, sometimes called the working backwards process. Before any new product is built at Amazon, the team writes a 1-page press release and a detailed FAQ as if the product has already launched. The press release forces the team to describe the product in the customer's language, in a form the customer would recognize and care about. If the press release doesn't describe something meaningfully better than what already exists, the idea dies on paper. The FAQ is where the challenge happens. The internal FAQ requires the team to answer every hard question that stakeholders would ask. What does this cost? What assumptions are we making about the market? What happens if those assumptions are wrong? What are the engineering risks? What does the timeline look like? The FAQ is the adversarial portion of the document. It is the section designed to kill the idea before resources are committed. Breyer and Carr are explicit about the intended failure rate, saying the fact that most PR FAQs don't get approved is a feature, not a bug. It's common for a team to write 10 or more drafts and to meet with senior leaders 5 or more times before receiving approval. Most never do. The process exists to say no. The default is rejection. The burden of proof is on the proposer. This is the structural inversion of the Bay of Pigs decision-making process from the previous episode. In the Bay of Pigs, the CIA presented a plan, and the implicit question was whether anyone could prove it would fail. That is an impossible standard. The PR FAQ flips the burden. The team must prove the idea will work under sustained interrogation before anyone writes a line of code. The third mechanism is a leadership principle. Have backbone, disagree, and commit. This was codified into Amazon's leadership principles around 2010. Though versions of the idea had circulated inside the company for years, the official text reads, "Leaders are obligated to respectfully challenge decisions when they disagree, even when doing so is uncomfortable or exhausting. Leaders have conviction and are tenacious. They do not compromise for the sake of social cohesion. Once a decision is determined, they commit wholly." The word obligated is doing the structural work there. This is an obligation built into how Amazon hires, evaluates, and promotes its leaders. The interview process assigns specific leadership principles to each interviewer, who's tasked with determining whether the candidate demonstrates the behavior in practice. Have backbone, disagree, and commit is assessed with questions like, tell me about a time you argued against a decision your direct manager was making. Tell me about a time you refused to accept the status quo. Have you ever made a deeply unpopular decision? Amazon screens for this at the door. The dissent mechanism starts before the employee's first day. Bezos himself modeled the second half of the principle. In his 2016 shareholder letter, Bezos described a situation in which his Amazon Studios team wanted to greenlight an original show, but he disagreed. He told them, "I disagree and commit, and hope it becomes the most watched thing we've ever made." He gave the team his genuine assessment, then committed wholly to their decision. The mechanism prevents two failure modes simultaneously: the reflexive consensus, where people agree to avoid discomfort, and the paralysis of perpetual disagreement, where nothing moves because no one will commit. There's a phrase repeated inside Amazon that captures the philosophy beneath all three mechanisms. Good intentions don't work. Mechanisms do. Disagree and commit did not originate at Amazon. The phrase traces back to Silicon Valley in the 80s. Scott McNealy, co-founder and CEO of Sun Microsystems, used the formulation as early as sometime between 1983 and 1991. His version was blunter. Agree and commit, disagree and commit, or get out of the way. The concept has also been attributed to Andy Grove at Intel, where it was embedded in a broader culture that Grove called constructive confrontation. Grove was the CEO who built Intel into the dominant chipmaker of the 20th century. He was also, by all accounts, terrifyingly direct. His management philosophy was that ideas should be subjected to fierce scrutiny, regardless of the rank of the person presenting them. An engineer who believed the facts pointed to a conclusion contrary to the CEO's was expected to argue for that conclusion. Grove's phrase, which Jim Collins documented in his research, was, "As a member of the Intel team, you carried the obligation to challenge any decision, any plan from anyone, provided your argument was grounded in data." At its best, constructive confrontation created a culture where people knew where they stood. A former Intel VP who later moved to another large Silicon Valley company described the difference. "Intel is much less passive-aggressive than this place. I always knew where things stood at Intel, whereas it's a lot murkier here." What Amazon did with this inheritance was to formalize it. Grove's constructive confrontation was a cultural norm, transmitted by example and enforced by the personal intensity of the founder. Amazon encoded it into its written principles, embedded it into hiring criteria, and made it measurable through performance evaluations. The shift from culture to mechanism matters for the argument of this series. A culture depends on the people who carry it. A mechanism can function without them. Or that's the theory. Whether the theory holds is the question this episode returns to. Charlie Munger died on November 28, 2023. He was 99 years old, a month shy of his 100th birthday. He had been the vice chairman of Berkshire Hathaway since 1978, and Warren Buffett's intellectual partner for more than 50 years. Buffett was the public face. Munger was the structural counterweight. His job, at the most basic level, was to say no. Buffett himself coined the nickname. He called Munger the abominable no man. The label was affectionate, but it described a structural role. Munger's function at Berkshire was to kill investment ideas before they could be approved. Every major capital allocation decision that Buffett contemplated went through Munger, and Munger's default position was skepticism. This worked in part because of Munger's temperament. Where Buffett was folksy and optimistic by disposition, Munger was acerbic and skeptical. But temperament alone does not explain the structural dynamics. Munger was independently wealthy when he joined Buffett in the mid-1970s. He didn't need the partnership for his livelihood. He had no financial incentive to defer. In the terminology of this show, Munger had something that almost none of the dissenters in the previous 6 episodes possessed. The carrying cost of his dissent was zero. He could say no indefinitely, at no personal cost, because his financial independence insulated him from the consequences that destroy most institutional dissenters. Munger's intellectual method rested on 2 principles that map directly to the structural argument of this series. The first is inversion. All I want to know is where I'm going to die, so that I'll never go there. Munger attributed the approach to a 19th century German mathematician named Carl Gustav Jakob Jacobi, who solved difficult problems by reversing them. Jacobi's rule: invert, always invert. Munger's application: instead of asking how an investment could succeed, ask how it could fail. Instead of asking what makes a good decision, identify what produces catastrophic ones and avoid those. The method is structurally identical to Kennedy's devil's advocate assignment in episode 6. Both force the decision-making process to confront the strongest case against its own conclusion before it can proceed. Kennedy achieved this by assigning Robert Kennedy to argue the opposing position. Munger achieved it by being the opposing position permanently, as a matter of professional identity. Munger brought inversion to every domain. He once described how he applied it during World War II, when he served as a meteorologist, clearing pilots for flights. His reasoning was, I said, suppose I want to kill a lot of pilots. What would be the easy way to do it? And I concluded that the only way to do it was to get the planes into icing the planes couldn't handle, or to get the pilot into a place where he'd run off fuel before he could safely land. So I made up my mind I was going to stay miles away from killing pilots by either icing or getting them sucked into conditions where they couldn't land. He inverted the question. He asked how to cause the disaster, then built his process to prevent it. The structural parallel to the PR FAQ is direct. Both force the decision maker to confront the failure mode before committing resources. Munger's second principle is the lattice work of mental models. He said, you've got to have models in your head, and you've got to array your experience, both vicarious and direct, on this lattice work of models. Munger argued that good decisions require thinking from multiple disciplines simultaneously. His models drew from psychology, economics, physics, biology, and history. He was contemptuous of single-discipline thinking. He was fond of saying, to a man with only a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. This matters for this show's structural argument. Every institutional failure documented in this series involved a group of people who shared the same training, the same assumptions, and the same framework for interpreting evidence. The Israeli intelligence analysts all shared the concept. The NASA managers all shared the schedule pressure and the normalization of deviance. The Bay of Pigs advisors all shared the Cold War consensus. When everyone in the room holds the same mental models, challenge becomes impossible because the challenge would require a framework that no one in the room possesses. Munger's antidote was deliberate cognitive diversity. He read voraciously across every field, precisely so that he could evaluate an investment thesis using tools drawn from outside the discipline of finance. This is a one-man version of Kennedy's strategy of opening the ex-com boundaries to outside perspectives. Munger opened his boundaries internally by maintaining a library of frameworks large enough that no single one could dominate. Buffett has said publicly that Munger saved him from many bad decisions, and that Berkshire's record could not have been built without Munger's willingness to say no. Munger himself put it more simply, it is remarkable how much long-term advantage people like us have gotten by trying to be consistently not stupid instead of trying to be very intelligent. The structural comparison between Amazon and Berkshire Hathaway is the analytical heart of this story. Both companies built mechanisms to challenge their own conclusions. They did it in fundamentally different ways, and the differences reveal the central tension of this entire series. Amazon built scalable processes. The 6-page memo works whether Bezos is in the room or not. The PR FAQ kills ideas before resources are committed, regardless of who wrote the document. Have backbone, disagree, and commit is assessed in hiring, measured in evaluations, required for promotion. The mechanism is embedded in the institutional architecture. It is designed to survive the departure of any individual, including the founder. Berkshire built a partnership. The dissent function was concentrated in one person. Munger's role depended on his specific temperament, his financial independence, his 50-year intellectual range, and his personal relationship with Buffett. There is no Munger procedure that a successor could execute. The mechanism was the man. These two models illustrate a structural question that has appeared in every episode of this show. What happens when the person who built the dissent mechanism leaves? In episode 1, the Devil's Advocate unit was institutionalized inside Israeli intelligence. It survived for 50 years. By October 7th, 2023, it had been ritualized into irrelevance. The mechanism existed. Its function had been hollowed out. In episode 4, CRM was institutionalized across the entire aviation industry. It doubled safety every decade for 50 years. Then, Boeing, under commercial pressure, selectively dismantled it for the 737 MAX. The mechanism existed. It was turned off when it became commercially inconvenient. In episode 6, Kennedy redesigned the room. The redesign was personal. One man learning from his own catastrophe, rebuilding the decision-making process in time for the Cuban Missile Crisis. The mechanism was tied to the individual. When Kennedy was assassinated in November 1963, the ex-com structure he had built went with him. Amazon represents the CRM model applied to corporate decision-making. Process-driven, scalable, designed to persist beyond any individual. Berkshire represents the Kennedy model, a leader who chose to have a permanent adversary at his side, whose effectiveness depended entirely on the specific people involved. Each architecture has a structural vulnerability. The process model can be ritualized. When the mechanism becomes routine, when the 6-page memo is a box to check and the leadership principle is a phrase to recite, the form survives, but the function decays. The Devil's Advocate unit filed reports for 50 years. The reports stopped mattering. The person model cannot be transferred. When Munger dies, the role he filled disappears. You can appoint a new vice chairman. You cannot appoint a new mind that has spent 50 years building a latticework of mental models across every discipline, backed by financial independence and personal relationship that made it possible to say no to Warren Buffett. The process model scales, but erodes. The person model is irreplaceable and expires. Every institution documented in this series has faced this trade-off. And every institution has eventually encountered the failure mode built into whichever architecture it chose. Here is the complication. In July 2024, Fortune magazine published a detailed investigation of Amazon's leadership principles based on interviews with 24 current and recently departed executives and managers. The picture they painted was of a company where the principles remain core, but have become, in the words of several insiders, weaponized. The principle earn trust has been deployed as a club to suppress dissent rather than encourage it. If you disagree with someone, you can accuse them of failing to earn trust with the organization. If you resist working overtime to deliver someone else's priority, they can claim you lack customer obsession or high standards. The 16 principles cover enough ground that almost any position can be framed as a violation of one of them. Ethan Evans, a former Amazon vice president, wrote publicly that the leadership principles get weaponized by leaders, quote, when they lack the power to give orders and resort to invoking a principle to force an outcome. The very mechanism designed to obligate dissent can be turned into the instrument that punishes it. And the mechanisms themselves have shown signs of erosion. PowerPoint presentations, once banned, now appear occasionally. One vice president directed her team to start with 1-page memos and expand to 6 as needed. The 2 principles Amazon added in 2021, strive to be Earth's best employer, and success and scale bring broad responsibility, were seen by many longtime employees as a marketing response to public criticism of warehouse conditions. Quote, they are clearly a marketing ploy, and they devalue the rest of the leadership principles. That was one former senior manager of more than 10 years telling Fortune. 3 years after Bezos left the CEO role, the company launched an hour-long internal video course in which his successor, Andy Jassy, explained each principle to employees. The fact that the principles needed explaining is itself telling. Under Bezos, they were transmitted by osmosis. You learned them by watching the people around you apply them. When transmission requires a training video, the living practice has become a curriculum. This pattern has a direct historical precedent. Intel's constructive confrontation was the ancestor of Amazon's approach. Under Andy Grove, it functioned as a culture of intellectual honesty. After Grove retired in 1998, the practice decayed. A former Intel employee, quoted by Stanford professor Robert Sutton, described the transformation, saying, constructive confrontation was a license for assholes to be assholes. The mechanism survived. The egalitarian enforcement that had made it productive collapsed. When managers put themselves above the culture's values, the tool that had been designed to challenge authority became a tool that authority wielded against subordinates. The structural point, a dissent mechanism, once it becomes cultural artifact instead of a living practice, can be turned into the instrument of the very consensus it was designed to challenge. The leadership principle designed to obligate disagreement can be cited to punish it. The memo designed to expose gaps in reasoning can be used to bury an idea in process. The PR FAQ designed to kill bad ideas can be used to kill inconvenient ones. This is the same failure mode as the Israeli Devil's Advocate unit from episode 1. The mechanism exists. It looks like dissent. It has been drained of its original function and refilled with the opposite one. I'm flagging this with the same discipline we tried to apply to the Politico Think revision in episode 6 and Diane Vaughan's normalization of deviance in episode 2, Amazon's mechanisms remain, in their design, the most sophisticated corporate architecture for institutional challenge that this show has documented. The complication does not dissolve the structural argument, it sharpens it. The design of the mechanism matters. So does the culture that operates it. And the culture, unlike the mechanism, cannot be written down in 16 principles and forced through a hiring rubric. The culture is the hardest part because the culture is the part that cannot be mechanized. In every shareholder letter Bezos wrote as CEO of Amazon, he signed off with the same phrase, "It remains day one." Someone once asked him what day two looks like. His answer was, day two is stasis, followed by irrelevance, followed by excruciating, painful decline, followed by death. And that is why it is always day one. Day one is Bezos' version of Munger's inversion. Instead of asking how to keep succeeding, identify what institutional death looks like and build every process to prevent it. The 6-page memo prevents decisions made on incomplete information. The PR FAQ prevents resources committed to ideas that cannot survive scrutiny. Disagree and commit prevents the reflexive consensus that Giannis documented in the Bay of Pigs and that this show has found in every domain it has examined. Each mechanism is a specific answer to a specific failure mode. Together, they constitute an architecture designed to keep a company on day one permanently by building the challenge function into every decision before the decision can calcify into consensus. The residue question is whether any such architecture can survive beyond the generation that built it. The evidence from this series is consistent and discouraging. The Devil's Advocate unit survived for 50 years and failed on October 7th, 2023. CRM doubled aviation safety for 50 years and was selectively dismantled by Boeing for the 737 MAX. Kennedy's XCOM redesign lasted 13 months and ended with an assassination. Munger's Dissent function lasted 50 years and ended with his death. Amazon's architecture is younger. Bezos stepped down as CEO in July 2021. The mechanisms he built remain intact. The principles are codified, the hiring process screens for them, the memo format persists, the PR FAQ still kills most proposals before they reach development. And the erosion has already begun, the weaponization, the PowerPoints creeping back, the training videos to explain what was once absorbed by practice, the 2 new principles that longtime employees see as dilution. This is the pattern this series keeps documenting. An institution experiences a catastrophic failure. Someone builds a mechanism to prevent it. The mechanism works, sometimes brilliantly, sometimes for decades. Then the mechanism decays because the people who operate it no longer remember why it was built, or because the mechanism becomes uncomfortable, or because someone decides it is commercially inconvenient. Charlie Munger's death in 2023 is the purest expression of this structural problem. Berkshire Hathaway lost the one person whose role was to say no. The investment decisions will continue, the capital allocation will continue, the annual shareholder meetings will continue. What will be missing is the permanent skeptic, the abominable no man, the partner whose structural function was to reject the thesis before it could be approved. Munger understood this. His entire intellectual framework, the lattice work of mental models, was an attempt to build the challenge function inside a single mind. He couldn't transfer it to an institution. He couldn't write it into 16 principles. He could only practice it for 50 years and hope that the example would persist after the person was gone. Whether it will is not yet known. Whether Amazon's mechanisms will hold is not yet known. Both are live experiments in the central question of this series. Whether any institution can build the challenge into its structure so deeply that the structure outlasts the people who designed it. The answer, across 6 previous episodes, has been eventually no. Eventually the mechanism decays, or is dismantled, or is turned against its original purpose. The question for this episode is whether Amazon and Berkshire have found architectures that can survive longer than their predecessors, or whether they're following the same curve on a different timeline. 2 companies tried to build challenge into the institutional architecture itself. Amazon encoded dissent into written mechanisms designed to survive the departure of the founder, narrative memos that expose the reasoning, a press release process designed to kill ideas before resources are committed, and a leadership principle that makes disagreement an obligation enforced through hiring and evaluation. Berkshire Hathaway concentrated the challenge function in one person, a partner with the independence, the temperament, and the intellectual range to say no to the most successful investor of the 20th century for 50 years at zero personal cost. Both architectures work. Both have structural vulnerabilities. The process can be ritualized until it loses its original function. The person cannot be replaced. The mechanisms of dissent are easier to design than to sustain. The architecture can be brilliant, the implementation can be faithful, and the decay begins the moment the people who built the mechanism are no longer the people who operate it. The institutional half-life of dissent is shorter than the institutional memory of why dissent matters. Munger's inversion asks, what would have to be true for this to fail? Bezos' day one asks, what does institutional death look like, and how do we prevent it? Both questions are the same question this show has been asking since the first episode, in different vocabularies, from different rooms. How do you build a structure that challenges its own confidence before the confidence has time to calcify? The answer, 7 episodes in, is that every institution in this series has built one, and every institution in this series has eventually watched it erode. In our next episode, The Laboratory. In 2003, a 19-year-old Stanford dropout named Elizabeth Holmes founded a company called Theranos, promising a revolution in blood testing. Over the next decade, she assembled a board of directors that included 2 former secretaries of state, a former secretary of defense, a former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and a former U.S. senator. Every mechanism of institutional challenge that this show has documented was absent from Theranos by design. The science was proprietary, which meant no peer review. The data was classified, which meant no independent verification. The technology was secret, which meant no outside expert could evaluate whether it worked. The board had authority, the board had prestige, the board lacked the one thing that every dissent mechanism in this series requires: access to the information that would make challenge possible. When the mechanism of challenge is blocked by the claim of secrecy, the structure produces the opposite of dissent. It produces a room full of credentialed people who have been given the authority to oversee and denied the information required to do it. Thanks for listening to The 10th Man. See you next time.